How many of you are currently training clients in person? Arms up, arms up. Now I am going to encourage participation throughout this, so I'm going to be asking you questions, so I am going to be testing your knowledge a little bit as we go through this. Let's dive in. Now before I dive in, what is this talk all about and why should you listen to me presenting it today? It's very simple that if you're working with clients in person and you're interested in maximizing the results that you get with your clients, if you're interested in standing out from what could arguably be argued as a very saturated industry, how many of you would say that you feel the industry is saturated? And now we could argue that the industry is either saturated or it's saturated with a lot of people but not necessarily a lot of quality, right? And so what is going to differentiate you from the hundreds of other trainers that are out there in Dubai? And very simply, it's going to be the quality of the service you can deliver, and a huge part of that is, sure, there's the time outside the sessions, there's the relationship with your clients, there's the time that you spend communicating and holding them accountable, but of course a huge part of what clients pay us for is the time that we deliver in person. So it's important to give maximal value for our service that we're making sure we deliver the best possible one-to-one experience. And part of that is what we're going to dive into today. So I'll give you a brief introduction. So I'm going to introduce myself first, who I am, my background, how long I've been in the industry. We're then going to get into the very subtle or not so subtle differences between strength and hypertrophy specific biomechanics. We're going to get into the influence of the different mechanisms of hypertrophy and how that should be influencing potentially your exercise selection, but also your exercise programming for specific clientele. We're then going to get into, and we're going to spend a bit of time in this section, we're going to get into some very practical examples, and this is the part where I'm going to start testing you guys and getting you involved in the presentation. We're then going to get into what I've kind of determined as muscle mechanics. Now, I've not created any of the stuff that we are going to talk about today. I'm not reinventing the wheel. We already know a hell of a lot about exercise physiology. We know a hell of a lot about biomechanics. All that I've done in creating this term muscle mechanics is I've put my spin on my own way of grouping these principles and concepts together into the term that I like to call muscle mechanics. And at the end of the presentation, we're just going to spend a little bit of time just kind of introducing you to some of the education that I'm planning to bring to the industry at the start of next year. That's going to kind of explore in a lot more detail the concepts that we're going to be covering in today's seminar. So, who is Ross Gilmore? Simple answer is, I'm still trying to figure that out myself. If I were to start somewhere, I would say that I'm co-founder of the Better Body Collective, which is a fairly new company that myself and my wife Mal, say hi Mal, have formed here in Dubai. We've been in Dubai for 7.5 years, working as coaches, been in the industry for just over 9 years. As far as our speciality goes, my biggest passion is biomechanics, hence why I'm here talking to you today. But very specifically, we like to work with clients focusing on body composition and a very evidence-based approach to nutrition as well. I've personally done, how many of you guys have heard of the MAC Nutrition certification? Yes, no? So I recently completed that with a distinction, and Malin's on our way to finishing that at the moment. I'm a proud husband. Mal and I have been at this for a long time. We've been working together for a long time. And we literally do support each other through everything as far as life, business, training, development. So we're very excited to have just launched this business, and we're really excited to see what we can do in terms of affecting as much change, not only in the general population here in the UAE, but also hopefully on the trainers' further development and education as well. A bit about what my background has been. So I've been a bit of a jack of all trades for a long time in the industry. I kind of dived into a lot of different things. In terms of my own training, I was doing competitive CrossFit for about 5 years. Went to regionals with part of a team, which is what you see on the right there. So I went to the Meridian Regionals in 2016. How many of you guys have done CrossFit or do CrossFit? Anyone? So you guys will know, to compete at that sort of level, It's a hell of a lot of work. It's 3-4 hours a day, 5-6 days a week, and at some stage something had to give. So that's not what then kind of made me pursue, what you can see me and my tighty whitey Calvin Kleins on the left, made me pursue a bit more of an interest in body composition. It's an area that Malin actually had a lot of experience in. She's competed on stage at the WBFF in London, I think it was 2014? 16. Was it that? It wasn't that late, was it? It was 2014.
I don't know.
And I've always had a passion and interest in body composition. It's certainly the thing that we've focused on predominantly with our clients. Outside of that, other experiences, I've worked in a couple of clinics here doing post-rehabilitation with clients as well. So I do really enjoy helping people with pain issues, spine, knee, hip, etc., and helping them can almost bridge the gap between when they see the clinical therapist and getting back into either performing at their best or just enjoying training and life pain-free again. All right, hypertrophy. So we're going to get into the meat and nuts of the presentation. So what are the key differences between lifting for strength and lifting for hypertrophy? Does anyone want to give me an attempted answer?
It's all about the counts.
So, what's your name, sorry?
Gilby.
So he mentioned, he said it's the difference in repetitions, but is that purely what differentiates strength and hypertrophy? What do you mean by repetitions?
When you say hypertrophy, we focus on counts like 8 to 12, and the strength is 6 below or 8 below.
So what he's saying there is that essentially the traditional way that strength and hypertrophy is thought of is that it falls within this very almost set rep ranges, but the reality is that hypertrophy is across quite a large spectrum, right? And we know that, especially from a lot of more recent research over the last 5 years, is that hypertrophy can actually be achieved across all rep ranges. It very much just depends on the application, it depends on the stimulus that you're actually going after. A lot of it's going to depend on, yes, reps is part of it, but of course we have to understand intensity, we have to understand volume, we also have to understand things like time under tension. There's a lot of variables that factor in, but if we are talking about traditionally strength versus hypertrophy, we know that percentage of 1 rep maximum has a huge bearing on strength, but in a bit more detail, what specifically is the difference on a physiological level between strength adaptations and hypertrophy adaptations? Anyone want to take a stab?
Get more size for the muscles or more bigger. For strength you get the more stronger to lift more or weight.
Okay, so on a physiological level, how does that occur? Why does that happen? Okay, well we're going to get into that anyway. You want to try?
I think it's because of the principles of biomechanics. In hypertrophy, the muscle fiber is increased, but in strength will be more recruitment for them. I think
We'll get into that. So can anyone, just for bonus points and for the first protein bar, can anyone tell me the two main types of hypertrophy? Does anyone want to take a stab at that? Anyone? So there's two types of hypertrophy you can elicit. Can anyone tell me what those are?
Might need to do some stories in a bit.
Okay, so we're going to get into that in a second. So there's one type of hypertrophy known as sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. What's the other one? So go on.
myofibrillar.
So you've got myofibrillar hypertrophy and you've got sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. We're going to get into the differences between those and why it's not just as simple as saying strength and hypertrophy. There is actually quite a bit of crossover depending on intensity, loading, sets, etc. For me, if I was to explain it simply, the key difference between strength and hypertrophy as far as training application goes is that it's an efficiency game versus inefficiency game. So what do I mean by efficiency versus inefficiency? Seen a lot of blank faces. So when I talk about efficiency versus inefficiency, Imagine you're a powerlifter, Olympic weightlifter. You're trying to move a load from point A to point B as quickly and efficiently as possible without utilizing as much energy. Whereas when you're using inefficiency, you're trying to make an exercise deliberately is taxing on that particular muscular system or energy system, depending on what the goal is, in that given exercise. Now, if I were to set you up for a bench press, for example, or a squat, whatever the movement is, and I'm trying to get you to get stronger, am I potentially going to get you to do 4-second eccentric tempo, 2-second pause, and then coming out of the hole? Probably not, right? Because why would that be detrimental to strength? Anyone? We just literally said it. It's just because it's extremely inefficient. So if you want to get stronger, the goal is to maximize efficiency. It makes no sense to make the exercise incredibly inefficient, but that's not the only way that we can make exercises more efficient or less efficient. But it's very, very important to understand what is the goal of the training, what is the goal of the exercise. That is going to very much dictate your approach. But I can imagine, I don't know, this is maybe something you guys have maybe seen in the past, but if you were going into a gym and you're maybe approaching, say, bench press with 4 sets of 8 and 5 sets of 5, that's just one parameter of how you're going to dictate the efficiency or inefficiency. Does it make much sense to perform those with the same tempo, with the same intent, and with the same cueing, potentially? Probably not, right? So we're going to get into that. Now, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, in very simple terms, is essentially it's the ability of the muscle tissue to store nutrients and glycogen to be able to swell in size. So sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is much more what we associate with bodybuilding, getting bigger, putting on mass. If we're looking at myofibrillar hypertrophy, there's 2 key proteins that are acting within the cell in order to achieve that. Does anyone know what those 2 proteins are? Actin and myosin, correct. So these are contractile proteins that are developed when you do hypertrophy, which is based on myofibrillar adaptation. Now, if we know that those are 2 very, very different outcomes, then it makes sense that the approach just cannot simply be the same. Now, with that said, there are times where there's going to be crossover between those 2. And so it's not as black and white just to say that we're going to do this many reps, this many sets, and that's it, or we're going to choose this movement. Motor unit recruitment versus hypertrophy mechanism. So we know that strength, on the most part, is very much a neurological adaptation, whereas when it comes to hypertrophy mechanism, what are the 3 hypertrophy mechanisms? Can anyone tell me? Three main mechanisms of hypertrophy. Anyone? No one wants a protein bar. So can anyone, the first one begins with M, so what's the first one? Mechanical tension, good man. Action takers get prizes. What's the second? You're not allowed to answer again. What's the second one? Begins with M as well. Muscular damage. What's the third one? Begins with M as well. Metabolic stress, or the other term we tend to use is metabolite accumulation. Now, this is why when you've got all these Gymshark models on Instagram doing 100 gazillion reps and they're wondering why they're not getting much bigger, you just do metabolic stress. That's one mechanism of 3. If you're wanting to maximally achieve hypertrophy, you best be making sure that your program has all 3 mechanisms stimulated, if not in the same program, across a set macro cycle. It might be that you have certain phases where you prioritize 2 over the other and vice versa, but generally speaking, a really well-balanced program is going to achieve all 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy across the phase. And then a big one, which is kind of the unspoken part of coaching and part of training for strength hypertrophy, is very much the intent. So what do I mean by intent? Yeah, so that's part of it. So, but the thing is, the goal is one thing, the intent. What do I mean by intent when it comes to execution? And see, it's interesting, right? Because it can be quite hard for a lot of people to quantify what it means by intent, but I'm going to dive into exactly what I mean by that as we get into this. But intent is essentially, you understand exactly what direction and what application of force you're choosing to use to achieve the given outcome, ultimately. And then, of course, we've got things like manipulation of resistance profiles. So what do I mean by resistance profile? Does anyone know the term resistance profile? Anyone familiar?
It's related to either the weight or the position, mean the directions. So, for example, the leg curl is different, the resistance, it will be different if I do front raise.
Leg raise? Yeah, somewhat. We'll dive into it more later, but you're about right. So essentially different exercises are going to have different what we call resistance curves. So let's just take for an example, when you do something like a leg extension, can anyone tell me what type of, like let's take a more global example. When you do a squat, what type of strength curve or resistance curve does a squat have? Can anyone tell me? So what would that be in terms of terminology? Yeah, so that's pretty much it. So you've got an ascending strength curve. When it comes to doing a row, what's that going to be? The opposite, right? So that's going to be a descending strength curve. Now, the strength curves have a huge role in exactly how we might go about applying intent to achieve a specific outcome. And then in terms of programming differences, of course, depending on what the goal is, whether it's strength, whether it's sarcoplasmic or myofibrillar hypertrophy, that's very much going to dictate, yes, the loading parameters in terms of percentage of 1 rep max, number of sets you might do, number of reps. Listen, of course, and we're going to get into this, as much as, you know, biomechanics is important as well, it does get to a point sometimes where people try to get so cute with it that they forget to actually train hard, they forget to actually lift sufficient weight. And listen, no one's going to argue that volume isn't important, that progressive overload isn't important. We need to do all of those things. What this is really about today is it's like, Mal, just come up here a second. Now you're going to imagine Mal has the world's biggest dumbbells in her hand, right? She's going to perform a lateral raise, but you're going to do it with a 1-1-3-1 tempo. Yeah, let's go. One more. All right, that looks very different from if someone was to go. How often have you seen that? Seen that plenty of times in the gym, right? Now, if we were to look purely at progressive overload, purely at volume, on a logbook, those would read the exact same thing if you used the same weight, you did the same number of reps, the same number of sets, according to the logbook, you've achieved the same outcome, right? Do you reckon those two things achieve the same outcome? Not even close, right? So it's very important, it's getting very trendy nowadays to beat the logbook, to make sure you're beating the week before, and that's fine, but the exercise has to be comparable. And often what we find is that when people try to progress in weight too quickly, or they try to just progress generally too quick, the exercise they were maybe doing in week 1, same exercise, is not even remotely comparable to the exercise they're doing at an end of a phase. And so therefore you're comparing volume, but you're comparing apples to oranges. Not quite, but close enough. All right, so what are the main considerations that influence programming and exercise selection? Just very quickly, what are the main things that influence programming and exercise selection? Goal, yep, goal. What else? Just shout out anything. Key considerations.
Client's current state.
Yep, so client's current state, are they coming to you with any injuries? Are they particularly well developed in one area? Or have they been training for years? What's the level of experience? Have they got any structural limitations? What program were they on last? When was the last time that they actually took a break from training? What's their current nutrition like? What's their sleep like? How well do they manage their autonomic nervous system? You can see that all of a sudden there becomes quite a myriad of factors that contribute to the potential selection of exercise. It might be, for a lot of people, they think, well, I'm just going to put a squat and this, and it's as simple as that. But the reality is, when it comes to exercise selection and the potential damage that we're imposing on an individual, and of course it's intentional damage, but the capacity to recover from that has to be very well thought of as well. Cool, so for me, when it comes to, if we're going to assume that lifestyle factors are all in check, we're going to assume that we're helping someone to manage their stress, we are going to make a very, very wild and non-true assumption that a client's being 100% on point with their nutrition, which any of us that have done any nutrition with clients know that it's really not that simple. We're going to make a lot of assumptions, so we're going to presuppose that clients are on point with nutrition, they're managing stress really well, they've no major injuries that we can think of. These would then be the main things that I'd be looking at as far as influencing programming. So of course, there's the mechanisms of hypertrophy that we talked about, and we'll get into this in a second, but there are some exercises that, yeah, you could potentially achieve all three mechanisms, but the reality is that there's going to be some exercises with certain loading parameters with a certain intent that are going to achieve the outcome of one of these far better than potentially another exercise. And so that's going to have a huge influence on exercise selection, how you load it, and what order it might come in a session, for example. You've then got things like training-specific considerations, so experience and competence, lifestyle factors, injury history, so on and so forth. Now, many exercises will provide the ability to achieve all three mechanisms of hypertrophy, but all dependent on their execution. Now, some exercises will be much suited to the job, and we're going to get into some specific examples in a moment. Now, achieving the desired stimulus of the target tissue is dependent on exercise execution being directed with accurate effort and intent. So if I were to sum up how an exercise should be selected, that statement at the top would probably be the key thing we'd be looking for. It's all about, can you achieve the desired stimulus in a safe environment with the minimum effective dose, essentially. Now, we're going to get into some of the practical components, and this is the part where we're going to start to really see what is your kind of current understanding or current biomechanical knowledge at this point in time. So I'm going to ask you, if you were to choose a lat pull down variation that would achieve the largest stimulus of the lats, which variation would you choose? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds, maybe discuss it with the person beside you, but I just want you to think, and then I'm going to come round, I'm going to ask a few of you what exercise you would have chose. Just have a think. Lats, what lat pull down variation would you use to achieve the greatest stimulus? Interesting. Okay. What would you answer? White cable. Alright guys, so that's 30 seconds, so I'm just going to come round and I'm just going to pick a couple of people at random. I want you to tell me which lat pull down variation, or yeah, what lat pull down variation would you use to get the most stimulus out of the lats?
So mechanical pose.
So hold on, you had the same answer as this guy, so you said?
Pull-ups.
So you said pull-ups, right? Anyone else got a different answer?
The rocking pull down.
Narrow grip, straight arm pull down, internally rotated. Narrow grip, lats on the most lengthened position. They work for full range.
Narrow grip, narrow.
Okay, cool. So how many of you would have said something that looks like this? How many of you said wide grip pull down or pull up or something along those lines, right? How many of you were thinking something more like that? Now, actually, this is technically not the best example, it was the only picture we had, but it covers the majority of the bases. The only thing I would do to modify that machine, and we'll get into some of this stuff later, is I'd possibly put like a D handle on there so that you could position your wrist in a more comfortable position and line it up with your structures. So why, just out of interest, why did you say the pull-up?
Because you're bringing your body weight, so it gives more tension and you can control the movement. So
Okay, so there's discussion there about tension. So I'll give you the answer to this. So what's going to dictate this as far as exercise selection goes? And that's why I usually say to people, listen, there's no right or wrong in terms of exercises, but there is achieving the goal and there's not achieving the goal at the same time. Now, when it comes to anatomy, if you know your anatomy, you know your origin insertions, and you understand biomechanics, this becomes a super easy answer. And the wide grip lat pull down wouldn't even come into the discussion. Why is that? What is the primary goal, primary two actions of the lat? Extension and? Exactly. So then, why would abduction work? And are we achieving extension there? Probably not, right? So essentially, if you look at these, you've got 4 origins and 1 insertion when it comes to the lats. So the insertion being the bicipital groove. You've then got the thoracolumbar spondylosis. You've got your L7 to T5. You've got your ilium, and you've also got your inferior scapular border. Did I get that right? Good. Just double checking, test myself. So knowing the origin to insertion, it makes sense then that when it comes to the intent that we would apply on the exercise selection, does it not then make sense that all of our exercise selection, our cueing, is generally going to follow the anatomical lines of pull of the given muscle? So for example, if we're doing a wide grip lat pull down, think about those muscle fibers, right? You can see that from the top of the humerus, the upper humerus down into the spine, it's a nice big fan shape in towards the base of the spine. So if we're doing a movement which is moving high and away, is that going to help us to achieve full contractile stimulation? Probably not, right? It's going to be something ideally that works close into the spine and works around towards the attachment points or the origin points. And so this can be found all the way through the body. So when it comes to exercise programming, if we know our biomechanics, we know our anatomy, then it makes choosing exercises to achieve maximal stimulation quite easy. Now, where it gets really potentially more complex and more fun is when you're trying to manipulate particular parts of the, like we discussed earlier, resistance profile, and that's where things get really, really interesting. So if you could only we're going to do another little quiz here, if you could only choose 2 quad exercises to achieve maximal stimulation of the quads, what would they be? So you can just shout anything. So what would be the 2 exercises you would choose? Anyone?
Front squat.
Front squat, that was one. Anyone else? Lunges, anything else? Leg extension, getting warm. Anything else?
Yes.
Anyone else, any movements? Pendulum squat. Pendulum squat, it's a very good shout. So, if I were to, and this is again, try to keep all my biases aside, if I'm looking at achieving the most stimulus for 2 exercises, and bear in mind this has to cover all 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy, it has to cover targeting and stimulating the tissue in both the lengthened position, the mid position, and the shortened position. Alright? It has to allow you to create sufficient intensity and load in all of those positions as well. So if you have 2 exercises to achieve that, and imagine I told you, right, you only have access to this and to this. That would make you start thinking very, very quick about how you're going to achieve that, right? Now, if you're lucky, like we are, and you're based out of the warehouse gym, or one of them, my first exercise would be a reverse banded hack squat. Now, the reason why is a couple of reasons. For how many guys would have said squat, like front squat or split squat or something like that? Now, if you were saying that, now what I'm going to say here, there's no right or wrong. I love front squats. I came from an Olympic lifting background. I do like them. However, and here's the caveat, if I were to say, are squats the best movement to achieve hypertrophy? I would argue, no. Why is that? If you look at what a squat is and everything that entails, especially say we take a front squat, first of all, those mobility limitations there for a lot of people. Are they actually able to hold it in a proper front rack, whether it's the old school bodybuilding one or the Olympic one? That's the first, that's the first consideration, give the game away. The next thing is coordination, balance, stability. Squats are a very high skill movement. Now, how many of us are working with clients who have got years and years and years of experience doing big lifts? Anyone? Any of you guys got clients that have literally got 5, 6, 8 years worth of experience doing like back squats, deadlift, any of that stuff? Not many of us, right? Not many of us will have clients that have got that sort of level of skill or experience. So as far as trying to achieve the best results in the shortest possible time, probably not going to be the best exercise selection. Just there's far too many things to control and consider. That doesn't mean that we don't try them. It's possibly not going to be our best option to achieve that goal. However, if a client's goal when they come to us, I want to be able to squat the absolute textbook form, so long as they don't have structural limitations or any big issues, fine, that's a perfectly fine goal, but not to achieve maximum hypertrophy. The reason why the reverse banded hack squat, where does this challenge you the most in this movement? What part of the movement is the most challenging? Just which position? It's the bottom, right? Why is it the hardest in that bottom position? That's close, right? So essentially the reason why we'll get into these is that it produces in that position the most torque. If you look at the lever between the midline of the body and the knee joint, the lever is the longest in that position, so you're going to achieve the greatest amount of torque at the joint. And ultimately, which we'll get into, torque is ultimately what dictates stimulus, not necessarily the load. Why? Because load is simply just a component of torque. The problem is with torque is you can't sit for every single repetition and calculate the torque. If you've ever seen torque calculations done, yeah, it's impossible. You'd need like a bloody computer program and attach things, and it's ridiculous. So the best way that we can actually record progress is sets, reps, and load. But it's not actually what dictates the response we get from an exercise, it's actually the amount of bone-to-bone force we can create between joints. The other reason why I choose this is why a reverse band? Why would I put a band on the hack squat and reverse band it? What's the reason for doing that? Yeah, it's close enough. So he said keep tension throughout the movement. Now I would say that even without a band, you're still going to have tension throughout the movement. The difference is the amount of torque that you're going to create is very different without a band than it is with a band. Now how many of you heard people say that, oh, but using a band just makes it easier? How many of you have heard people say that? You see band up stuff like, oh, that just makes it easier. Why is that an incredibly foolish assumption to make? I'll tell you why. You might be able to add more load to the machine, but here's the difference. If we look at when it comes to the bottom of a squat or a hack squat, we're at a mechanical disadvantage. We're in that bottom position, right? Why? Because there's the longest lever. We're in the most vulnerable position at that point. What happens is I start to extend through the squat. You gain what? Mechanical advantage. So there's an opportunity there that we're missing potentially if we just do the hack squat without the band. If I'm doing the hack squat without the band, at some point in that movement, what's going to happen? Easy. There's not much stress, the lever becomes shorter and shorter and shorter, there's not much of a challenge. So if I reverse band it, the weight that I would have had without a band in the bottom initially is the same. Even though weight's dropping off as you go down, you're still using the same load as you were before with less weight on it. The only difference is now is as you get to the top of that hack squat, you're now overloading that short position, so you're achieving a much greater amount of torque in the top half of that movement. So then it's easy to see why doing something like a reverse band hack squat versus a regular one is a far more complete movement, because you can achieve a far greater stimulus. So this is just one example. And the other one would be the leg extension. Why? Because there's no exercise quite like a leg extension done properly, doing proper full lockout knot, that really gets that quad in its fully shortened contractile range. So those would be my two go-to exercises if I wanted to achieve full maximal hypertrophy development of the quads. So then people would ask, like, what about the big three? You know, there's this whole argument about integration versus isolation, and let's be honest, there's no true way that you ever isolate an exercise. Because in order to be able to perform an isolation exercise, you have to be able to stabilize and isometrically contract a lot of things, right? So there's nothing that's truly isolated. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't place a greater amount of emphasis on a particular body part if that's the goal. And again, there's nothing wrong, depending on the goal, or even as part of a hypertrophy program, having movements which integrate a lot of things together. So you just have to be mindful as what is the return on investment for doing that movement. And it might be that a particular movement, a more integrated movement, is essential to get someone to a position where they can get the most out of an exercise. But you just always have to be conscious, is this achieving the outcome that I want? So the key takeaway here is brushing up on your anatomy and physiology will have a huge payoff for not only your own training, but for your client's training as well. Now, this is just a picture of, any of you guys heard of the muscle mentors? Heard of them? Anyone? Muscle mentors? So if anyone's big into the body composition realm at the moment, you'll have heard of Callum Rystrick, Luke Hoffman, etc. So Callum's my coach. Very, very intelligent guys. So this is full credit to him for creating this, but this gives a very true example of the different concepts that we're looking at here, and it almost encompasses all four of them. So you'll probably notice there on the picture, sorry, it's a bit tough for you guys possibly to see this, but he's in the Cybex, what's it called, Maestro, what's it called, the Cybex machine with the pad. So he's got a back pad there that he's leaning back into. That covers the bracing element, so he's able to lose any dissipated force elsewhere from having to stabilize because he can brace his body into the pad. So that's bracing. All bracing is it's the ability of being able to control a joint to stop any unwanted force loss or production. All right? And then you've got torque, which we talked about, alignment, so alignment of the joint, the tissues, the line of force, and then you've got the exercise profile. The exercise profile being things like, is this an ascending strength curve? What type of drop-off does it have in given positions? What type of hypertrophy stimulus does this best target? All those sort of things. So these are the key concepts when it comes to choosing exercises and setting up a program. We should be very mindful of making sure that we're covering a lot, or utilizing at least most of these concepts, if we're being really smart about achieving maximal results in the shortest time possible. Now, how many of your clients come to you and they've got a very time-specific goal to change their physique? Now, of course, a big problem with the industry is people think that they can achieve it in a much shorter time than is actually possible. That's a discussion for another day. But the reality is that they still want to see results in their training. And so if we're not using every tool possible to achieve that, we're selling ourselves short, we're selling them short as well. So let's talk torque for a moment. Now, any of the geeky people in here would find that really funny. That's actually a joke. It's terrible, I know, it's a terrible joke. So how many of you have heard of the moment arm? We understand the moment arm, right? So what is the moment arm? Can anyone tell me the moment arm, the definition?
The movable part.
No, but what it is the moment arm is the perpendicular line or distance between the line of force and the axis of the joint. And so if I go back to just this previous example real quick, you guys can see that Callum's elbow in this position, so what is essentially a bicep curl? If we're going to be anatomical about it, it's elbow flexion, right? And so the axis in this particular instance is going to be the elbow joint. So in which case, the thing is about the moment arm is the moment arm, like you could say, and this is controversial, like calories is a moving target. It's not always fixed, it has movement throughout it. So in which case, when it comes to the moment arm, depending on which part of the movement you're in, that moment arm is constantly changing and the line of force is constantly changing as well. And this is where biomechanics potentially can get a bit complex, but if you just take your time and you kind of look through the different components of the movement, it's quite easy to break down. So you'll notice here just with Callum, as an example, as he starts that movement, he's got a very long moment arm, all right? And then as he goes through the movement, it will start to essentially get a little bit more, you would say challenging. And then as he gets towards the top, it's going to get a bit easier. Now you'll notice, I don't have a pointer here, in that bottom picture, the moment arm is a lot shorter. Now this is also a very interesting example because we talked about ascending resistance curves and descending resistance curves. What other type of resistance curve is there? So you have what's called a bell-shaped resistance curve. So some exercises have a strong to weak to strong or a weak to strong to weak profile. those are a little bit more tricky. Now this is a very good example of that, because in this particular movement, it goes from being kind of fairly easy to being really difficult in that middle portion to when it gets past a certain point, it's going to drop off. And all of that is to do nothing with the load. The load he's using is exactly the same, still in the same position. The only thing that's changed in that particular position is the moment arm is changing length throughout the movement. And so what that tells us then is it just shows you that load, when it comes to performing an exercise, isn't just the key determinant of whether an exercise is hard or not. Very much the moment arm, the load, and the intent are going to dictate a hell of a lot how easy or hard an exercise is going to be at a given point. Alright, so torque is what I would essentially call the end game, and like I always like to remind people, load is just a component of torque. This is why you can progress someone in a program or an exercise without increasing the load. You could literally progress someone for 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks. Now I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that, but you could without ever increasing the load. You could absolutely milk the load for everything it's worth simply by manipulating things like tempo, manipulating the moment arm, manipulating the resistance profile. And how many of our clients have maybe hit a point with an exercise and they just can't get past a certain weight? They're just literally stuck there. It doesn't matter whether you do, you know, rest, pause, whatever it is, you use all these methods, but they just can't get past a certain point. There's plenty of other paths we can go down, but if we just restrict ourselves to reps and loads, we're missing out on a big opportunity to get progress. So if I bring Mal back up again, sorry Mal. Just to give a very, very real example right in front of you doing this, right? So if I get Mal just to raise our arm out about 20 degrees, now it's quite tough, just stop me doing that, it's quite tough for me to move her in this position, unless I catch her by surprise, all right? If I get her to come up to 45 degrees, go again, it's a lot easier, right? Now why is it so much easier for me to move her in that position than it is down there? She's applying the same amount of force here as she is up here. So why is it more difficult? The moment arm is significantly longer. If I go from here to here, that moment arm is from the joint, in this case the shoulder, to here, very short. That's a much different position than it is down there. Now, that's why when it comes to the side delts, you see many people, they just chucking away through the lateral raises. I love lateral raises, there's nothing wrong with them, but could we make a more complete exercise potentially? And there's certainly ways you can do that. Now, it might be that I would argue that if you're wanting to maximally grow the side delts, if you were only doing dumbbell lateral raises, you'd be selling yourself really, really short. So these are just some examples. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that you go with your clients and start banding everything and chucking daisy chains and doing all sorts of mad stuff. They need to achieve competence in how to move first, obviously. They need to become very proficient at doing the basics right first. However, once they get to a point where they're doing things proficiently, why not move on to some better choices of exercises? Now, how many of you guys have seen the cuffed laterals? People doing those? I know Milos has for sure. Anyone else? Yeah. So who made those popular? Anyone guess? How many of you guys have heard of the hypertrophy coach? Joe Bennett. Arms up. Anyone heard of the hypertrophy coach? Pretty smart guy. He very much popularized the cuff lateral raise. It was lying down initially, then standing. And the reason why is that if you look at a lateral raise, we know how much harder it gets towards the top, whereas when you do cuff lateral raises, it's a much more even resistance challenge throughout the movement. Now that doesn't mean that dumbbell lateral raises are out of the picture, it's just that if we're trying to achieve a particular outcome, we just might want to consider if lateral raise dumbbells are the only movement we choose for that. And then we've got examples here, so as you'll see here, you've got ascending strength curve on the right with the pendulum squats. I think Milos mentioned this earlier with the what exercise you would choose. Again, a very good option for maximally stimulating the quads in the lengthened position because of the position you're in. That's an ascending strength curve. What the daisy chain is essentially doing there, and this is where it gets interesting. So how many of you guys have used accommodating resistance? Bands, like put bands on things for like bench press, squats, that stuff, right? Now, the problem is, with a lot of accommodating resistance setups is that the resistance of the band is on throughout the entire movement, and that's often not a very good idea. Why? Because you're at a point sometimes where the movement is already significantly challenging enough. You don't need any additional resistance at that point. So in this case of the pendulum squat, in that bottom position, I don't need any additional tension from the band because it's already freaking hard enough. There's a lot of tension, the lever is at its longest point. However, and as anyone who's ever done a pendulum squat, how many of you guys have done pendulum squats? Anyone? Tried it? You need to go to the warehouse gym, that's what you need to do. All right, so when it comes to the pendulum squat, as you get up towards the top half of the movement, it significantly drops off. It almost becomes a non-challenge almost completely. Whereas what that daisy chain does is that as you go down, there's resistance on the band, and just as you get halfway down, the resistance completely comes off, which is very different if you were to use just the band only. All right, and then as you come up out of that bottom position, it's already hard, and just as it would start to get easier, that band picks up just at the right moment, and it gets harder still. Other methods for maximizing output, you've got overloading ranges of mechanical advantage. So like I said, with things like the pendulum squat, it's a bit different from the pendulum squat to the hack squat in this example. So in this example, like we talked about earlier, the load is dropping off into that bottom position, and then as you come out the hole, that band resistance drops off. It means you get that overload in the top position. And then for example, the daisy chain for the bench press here, in this position you have the most torque because the moment arm is the longest. As you're coming out and as you're getting to a point where it becomes almost a non-challenge or minimal challenge, that band essentially drops off and the full load kicks in. So these are just little ways that you can make resistance profiles far more even to achieve a more even challenge throughout the movement. Other things as well, nailing alignment through modification. So alignment of joints and alignment of the muscle fibers you're trying to work is another one of those overlooked areas. What do you think is going to happen, for example, if we're doing a bicep curl and our arms are in this flared position? Where do you think a lot of the stress or force is going to be directed? Potentially shoulders, where else? Potentially the elbows as well, pecs as well potentially. So sometimes it might be that it's just a case of changing your torso position. In this case, we didn't have a very good bench, so it was a case of setting everything up so that the joint and the tissue is in a very favourable position to direct all of your effort in that particular direction. It's a much more efficient way to produce force on that given muscle. And this is just two examples. It just so happened to be arms, and it just so happened to be one with me with my shirt off. That's another thing. And then bracing. So we talked about bracing earlier. Bracing is that ability, often using a counter force on the antagonist. So in this case, you got the bicep muscle. Tricep is pressing back against the lat pull down seated pad. That allows you to drive more force into the target direction that you want to do. Just a very good exercise. If you've got a lot of clients who really struggle with biceps, or they tend to want to move their elbows all over the place, that's a very good way to do that. And then on the second one, it might be hard to see what's going on there, but essentially I've modified a resistance band over like a seat belt to stop my hips from shooting up. Because what's the first thing you do when you start to lock out on leg extension or use lots of weight? The hips start to lift off the pad, right? So what this does is it allows you to keep those hips planted and allow you to direct all of the force into that shortened position. So these are just little things you can help to do to maximize that direction of force and the intended direction and tissue that you want. I wouldn't use it for a leg curl, but that's a good question. I can explain why afterwards though. So, to kind of try and get to the end point, methods are only as good as the practical application of the principles they belong to. So listen, these are all methods. Ultimately, you have to very much understand the principles that you're deriving in order to use those methods. If you're not applying it with principles in mind, often the intention, with good intention, can be misdirected, and it's important that we understand why we're doing what we're doing. So this brings us to the end. As of January, I'm planning to run a set of, now how many of you guys, when it comes to education in the region, feel like there's enough courses on offer on things that you're actually interested in? Put your arms up. How many of you have found that often you've wanted to attend courses but there's nothing that really interests you all that much? Arms up. Be honest. I'm keeping my hand up because, to be honest, there's only so much TRX, kettlebell, BOSU ball training you can do, right? At some stage, some of us want to kind of take a step up, we want to take a level up in our understanding, right? So, other thing as well is how many of you find it difficult to take 3 days off on a weekend to attend a course? How often do you not just want to take time off for a course? Sometimes you're like, freaking hell, I work my ass off, Sunday to Thursday, Friday potentially. I don't want to spend my whole weekend and then go back into another week of work. So that's also an issue that I found as well from delivering courses here. So what I decided to do is I decided to put together an educational series where it's essentially in the format of a 3-day seminar but condensed into 1 to 2 hour modules. So what that does then is that we can essentially cover all of these things that we're talking about, but we're splitting them up into per muscle group modules that you can do at your own pace. You don't have to do them in any particular order. You just then choose a muscle group that you want to essentially learn about first, tick that off the list, and over time, you're essentially just then collecting all of the modules, and then after each module, you have a case study to go and do. So you have to go away, you have to show putting this into practice, and then you have to submit that back for it to be critiqued, evaluated, etc. So it's not one of those courses where you just turn up, you get a whole bunch of information just vomited on you, and then you go away like, where do I even start with all of this? And that's a big issue. We just want bite-sized information that's digestible to be able to apply it straight away. So when I started putting this together, I kind of put it in that format of, well, why not just focus on one body part, learn everything there is to know about the anatomy, the origin, the insertion, the functional anatomy, exercise selection, programming selection for that muscle group, and you just piece each one together one by one, and eventually once you've finished all of that, you're in a position where you can really apply a sound set of principles and techniques to a full client's journey and program. Of course, as well, with these results as well, you can ideally achieve faster results with your clients. The great thing as well is that each module will have CPD points, so rather than attending courses that you just really don't want to just to get the CPD points, you can actually attend courses you want to attend and get the CPD points as well. So isn't that a juicy brucey bonus? And the big thing for me, and this is a huge part of our service at the Better Body Collective, is we're in an industry where there's a lot of cookie cutter stuff out there, and if you want to separate yourself away from other trainers in your field, in your gym, in your area, you have to be able to provide a very individualized service, and that only comes from increasing your knowledge and application of knowledge over time. Okay, so if anyone is interested in that, we are going to be sending out more information via email to that, so I think we have all of your guys' emails. If you are interested to know more about some of the stuff we talked about today, please do just reach out to me directly. So I'm on Instagram at Coach Ross Gilmore. You can also go to at Better Body Collective, and yeah, I'd be more than happy after this presentation or any time in the near future before we release the course. If anyone's got any questions about biomechanics, about hypertrophy specific training, about the concepts we discussed, or what the course is going to look like once it's released, I'd be more than happy to answer, to help. Thank you guys very much. If you've got any questions, I'll be sticking around for the next 20 minutes. Thank you.